Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled case for the libertarian philosophy, makes the case for the genuinely free society, which we've done for some 32 years. So this week is the 80th anniversary of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And so naturally there's lots of op-eds, lots of editorials about that particular attack. And of course, the official story continues to be made that U.S. officials were shocked over this attack, that President Roosevelt was stunned, that he goes before Congress and exclaims that this is a day that will live in infamy, making the case that this was a surprise attack, that no one knew it was coming. This is absolute nonsense. It's been a lie from the very beginning. And that's what I want to talk to you about, the lies that went in to the December 7th attack. But in order to understand these lies, it's necessary to go back to World War I, or even before World War I, to understand what was going on in the event in the days leading up to the December 7th, 1941 attack. We begin with the idea that the United States was founded as a non-interventionist nation. What that means is that the U.S. government would not go abroad and involve itself in European wars. It would not involve itself in Asian wars. It would not try to free people from tyranny or oppression or authoritarian or totalitarian regimes, that it would instead just stay at home. Now, there's people today that call that isolationism, which is ridiculous. All that it's doing is saying the U.S. government's not going to be getting embroiled in foreign wars. But at the same time, you can liberate the private sector to interact with the people of the world, which is the exact opposite of isolating the nation. Today, as we all know, it's the exact opposite. The U.S. government has free reign to intervene anywhere in the world, and it's the American people who are isolated from the rest of the world with trade wars, sanctions, embargoes, travel restrictions, and the like. So our founding foreign policy was non-interventionism. This was captured in the famous speech by John Quincy Adams, In Search of Monsters to Destroy, which he delivered to Congress on the 4th of July, 1821. And he said, this is not what America's mission is, to go abroad to slay monsters. And by monsters, he was referring to getting involved in Europe's forever wars or Asia's forever wars, or freeing people from tyranny, oppression, famine, starvation, and the like, or dictatorship. And that the U.S. government would not go abroad in search of these monsters to destroy. At the same time, America, as many of you know, had a policy of open immigration, which essentially sent the message out to the world, to the people of the world, that if you're suffering under tyranny, oppression, famine, whatever, our government will not come over there to save you. But if you're able to escape, and you're willing to escape, and you're willing to move to another country, there is at least one nation on earth that will not forcibly repatriate you. That is, this country will not take you into custody and will not force you to go back to the country from which you escaped. Remarkable system. And that lasted for around, well over 100 years, or about 100 years. Well, in the late 1800s, public opinion starts to shift. You've got new generations of Americans, and the people now start advocating for an imperial foreign policy, one that in which the U.S. had colonies, because the idea was that in order for a nation to be great, it had to have colonies, and they would look at the British Empire and the French Empire and so forth. And so they intervened in the Spanish-American War in 1898, which was based on a lie. They told the Cuban people and the Guatemalan people, Filipinos, that they were coming to their assistance, helping them win independence from the Spanish Empire, which was true. But where the lie came in was they weren't really going to be independent after all, even though that's what U.S. officials led them to believe. That after the war was won against Spain, U.S. officials said, hey, we got some bad news for you. We're now stepping in the shoes of the Spanish Empire. We now control you instead of the Spanish Empire. And that's how Spain, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Guam, and others became colonies of the U.S. government. At the same time, there was this mindset moving toward interventionism in Europe's wars. And that culminates, of course, with World War I. this was a war that really didn't involve the United States at all. But President Wilson was hell-bent on getting the United States involved in it. He figured that with U.S. power, he was finally going to show the cow how to eat the cabbage here. That he was going to intervene and finally end all European wars. That this was going to be the war to end all wars. That was his goal, as well as to make the world safe for democracy. Well, it was a vicious, nasty intervention, and especially here at home, it showed that what happens to people's liberties here at home when the government's engaged in a foreign war, thousands of miles away. There was a massive crackdown on civil liberties. People were jailed for questioning the war, questioning conscription. I mean, imagine the irony that here you are supposedly fighting for freedom and democracy and so forth, and they're forcing American men to go give up their lives in this quest. I mean, how can that possibly be reconciled with freedom at all? And the fact that they had to resort to conscription, a draft, which is just forced slavery, shows you that there was not overwhelming support for Wilson's folly. And it turned out to be a folly. At the end of the war, U.S. interventionism had brought about the total defeat of Germany. If the U.S. had not intervened, it is a virtual certainty that the powers that were at war would have had to enter into a negotiated peace. They'd already lost, I don't know, I forget what the numbers are, but untold numbers of men on both sides. And unless they wanted to decimate their entire, population of men, they would have had to have entered into a negotiated peace. Well, the U.S. intervenes, and instead of a negotiated peace, it is the total defeat of Germany and the imposition of the vicious Treaty of Versailles, which turned out to be very humiliating for Germany. And that's what Hitler used as a way to rise to power. He relied on the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles to rile up the German people into supporting the Nazi regime. So in a very real sense, U.S. interventionism leads to the total defeat of Germany, to the Treaty of Versailles, which in turn then gives rise to Hitler, which then ends up with World War II, which was really just a continuation of World War I. In fact, when Britain declared war on Germany, and that's the way it happened, it was not the other way around, it was because they had issued this guarantee to Poland that we're going to guarantee your freedom. So Hitler takes over Poland. He's clearly moving east. Hitler was as much an anti-communist as U.S. officials were after World War II, when they started the Cold War and so forth against the Soviet Union. Well, Hitler was of that same anti-communist mindset. He was clearly moving east. He absorbs Poland, Czechoslovakia. He hated the Soviet Union. But there was no way that Britain could ever enforce that guarantee. And so it was a false, empty guarantee. And sure enough, at the end of World War II, Britain's celebrating, the U.S. is celebrating this great victory, but the Poles are not celebrating at all. Neither are the Czechs, and neither are the other people in Eastern Europe. And that's because they were now suffering under Soviet communism for the next 30 years or so. They never considered World War II to be a victory. Well, even though the U.S. did, because it was their ally, the Soviet Union, which they then converted into an official enemy at the end of the war. Well, Americans were so chagrined over what had happened in World War I that they just said never again. And from the end of World War I to the start of World War II, it was pretty much a mindset that was a restoration of the philosophy of non-interventionism on which America had been founded. Americans just didn't want another role in another European war. So when war breaks out again, when England declares war on Germany, the American people say, count us out. We want no part of this at all. They had seen the massive death toll. They had seen the massive loss of liberty, especially civil liberties here at home, freedom of speech and other civil liberties, and the massive loss of taxpayer money, waste of taxpayer money. They just said no, and they were overwhelmingly opposed to entry into the war, to World War II. Well, in 1940, when Franklin Roosevelt was running for an unprecedented fourth term, as president, he expressed this non-interventionist mindset to the American people. He made it look like he was one of them, that he believed like they believed. And there's that famous line that he used. He says, "I've said this before, but I will say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into foreign wars." Okay? And he did that because he knew that was the popular sentiment. In fact, there was an organization called the America First Committee that was composed of I don't know how many, thousands upon thousands of Americans, and very prominent Americans. And their objective was stay out of World War II. And I don't know what the percentage is in terms of public opinion polls, but if I had to guess, it would be like at least 90% of Americans opposed entry into World War II. So Roosevelt, in trying to get reelected for this unprecedented fourth term, tells the American people that he's with them. He's one of them. He opposes this entry into these foreign wars just like they do. The problem is that Roosevelt was lying, intentionally, knowing, and deliberately lying. He was doing it only to get votes, only to get reelected. But he knew that as soon as he got reelected, he would do everything he could to get America into the war. And in fact, he was secretly trying to do that as president. He was doing everything he could. He had already vowed to Winston Churchill, who was leading the English effort, that he would do what he could to get the U.S. involved in the war on the side of England. And so he was putting American ships in harm's way in the Atlantic, indirectly helping the English forces or English ships, doing everything he could to provoke the Germans into attacking American vessels. Now, why would that make a difference? Well, it was at this point in time that the U.S. officials were, including presidents, were still obeying the constitutional restriction requiring a congressional declaration of war as a prerequisite for waging war. When the Constitution called the federal government into existence, the framers understood the propensity of presidents or rulers to embroil their nations in war. So they said, well, the U.S. government and its system is going to be different. The president, the ruler of this country, is not going to have the authority to take the nation into war. He will have the authority to wage the war once the nation does enter a war, but he will not be the deciding factor in whether the nation goes to war or not. So even though a president fully wanted to go to war against a particular nation state, he was prohibited from doing that by the Constitution. The body that would decide whether to go to war or not would be Congress. And that would be through a declaration of war against some other nation state. So in order to go to war, the president would have to first secure a declaration of war from Congress. If he went to war without that, it would be an illegal war. He could be impeached for it. So Roosevelt knew he had to get a congressional declaration of war against Germany, but he also knew that there was no chance of that happening, owing to the overwhelming opposition to getting involved in World War II among the American people. That is to say that if Roosevelt had gone to Congress and said, look, I've made this secret vow to Churchill, I really think we need to enter this war, give me a congressional declaration of war, Congress would never have gone along with the deal. There was just too much overwhelming sentiment against it, and Roosevelt knew that. So Roosevelt figured, if I can provoke the Germans into attacking an American ship in the Atlantic, then Congress will have no choice. It will have to declare war on grounds of self-defense, because we can't allow ourselves to be attacked and then not do anything about it, right? So he did everything he could to get the Germans to take the bait. But the Germans knew what he was doing and refused to take the bait. They just did everything they could to avoid getting involved in another war with the United States. So this was completely frustrating Roosevelt's efforts, especially after he got reelected to this unprecedented fourth term. It was like, well, now what does he do? The Germans aren't taking his bait. He wants to get involved in this war. How does he overcome what he considers to be the ignorance of the American people. You see, because the mindset was, oh, Germany will try to conquer the world, and the American people are just too naive. They're just too dumb. They don't understand the dangers here. The president knows best, and so he has to figure out some way to circumvent their will, which is really ironic because, in a democracy, especially a limited government republic democracy, it was the people that decide these things, right or wrong, not the president. And the president is saying, well, the people are too dumb, and I know what's best because Germany is going to end up conquering the world, which was ludicrous. Germany, as it turned out, couldn't even cross the English Channel to successfully invade England. How is it going to cross the Atlantic Ocean, especially without a navy with the capability of doing that? But that was the notion, that, we have to get in there. The American people don't know what they're doing. I need to figure out a way to circumvent their will. This was Roosevelt's mindset. So what he did was, this guy was wily. And one thing about Roosevelt, he was one wily guy. He says, well, what I'll do is I'll go into the Pacific, and I'll see if my little provocation scheme will work against the Japanese. Now, there was a big problem there, that even though it may work against the Japanese, it doesn't necessarily guarantee entry into the European war. It theoretically could just end up with a U.S. war against Japan. But Roosevelt was willing to take that chance. He saw that a war with Japan might very well give him his backdoor to war with Germany in Europe. So he embarks on this course of conduct designed to provoke the Japanese into attacking the United States. This is what he wanted to happen. This is his goal. This is what historians often forget, is that Roosevelt really wanted the Japanese to attack the United States, because that would give him his provocation, just like he wanted Germany to attack the United States. And he could say self-defense, day of infamy, and so forth. So he takes these steps. He freezes Japanese bank accounts, which he had no authority to do. The United States wasn't at war with Japan. But more important, he organizes and carries out, orchestrates this enormous oil embargo on Japan, which is tremendously effective. Now, Japan had invaded China. They had this massive war machine going on in China. They were still involved in war activities in China. Their army desperately depended on oil to keep going in China. Without oil, they're going to have to exit China, which is exactly what Roosevelt was demanding. He was demanding Japan exit China. What gave him this authority to order a foreign nation to get out of another nation? Well, he knew he had no such authority, but he was trying to provoke Japan. He was trying to get them mad, and he was trying to deprive them of oil for their oil machine, to put them in this position of either exiting China, which they clearly did not want to do, especially after they had gone so far to invade China. And so the Japanese were put into a real corner here. Roosevelt's policy was very effective. They calculate that their oil reserves are going to run out at a certain point unless this oil embargo is lifted, and there's no indication that Roosevelt is going to lift the embargo. They meet with U.S. officials in Washington trying to figure out a way around this thing, but Roosevelt was not going to give them a way around this thing. In fact, the surrender, well, I say surrender terms, the terms that he put on them to resolve the deal were so ridiculous and so humiliating that he knew the Japanese would just react with anger over those conditions. So the Japanese are sitting there saying, well, what do we do now? And the only chance they had to get oil was in the Dutch East Indies. But they knew that if they invaded the Dutch East Indies to get oil, the U.S. naval fleet would be able to come and intercept them and go to war with them and interfere with their ability to get oil in Dutch East Indies. So they figured that the only chance they had was to try to knock out the U.S. fleet. And that would give them the opportunity to go into the Dutch East Indies and have this free flow of oil to carry on their war machine in China. So that was the idea of attacking Pearl Harbor. They figured that they would try to knock out as much of the fleet as possible in order to give themselves a free hand. Well, Roosevelt wanted this attack to happen. And even Roosevelt apologists acknowledged that was his goal, to provoke the Japanese into attacking the United States somewhere. Well, Roosevelt leaves bait out there. He leaves all these men in the Philippines, U.S. troops. Now, ask yourself, what are U.S. troops doing in the Philippines? I mean, that's nowhere near the United States. I don't know how many thousands of miles, 6,000 miles, 7,000 miles, whatever it is. That's a long ways away from the United States. Well, remember that the Philippines were acquired in this imperialist war in 1898. They acquired the Philippines as a colony, and the Filipinos had continued fighting. They had gotten into that war against Spain for their independence, and when the U.S. said, well, we're now taking control of you, the Filipinos said, no, you're not. And they went to war against the United States. A lot of Americans don't realize that. And the U.S. Waged war against them without a congressional declaration of war and killed multitudes. I forget the numbers, but I think it's hundreds of thousands of Filipinos who were doing nothing more than fighting for their independence. There was also massive waterboarding and other forms of torture that U.S. Military forces inflicted on the Filipinos. So, as part of this colony that had been acquired in the Spanish-American War, Roosevelt puts all these troops there, headed by General MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur, as bait. I mean, that's a pretty easy target for Japan to attack. And if Japan had attacked there and only there, clearly Roosevelt would have said the same thing about what he said at Pearl Harbor. Oh, we've been attacked. I'm shocked. I'm stunned. I mean, we had these soldiers there innocently minding their own business, and I had no idea this was going to happen. But instead, the Japanese ended up attacking at both places. Now, Roosevelt was smart. He leaves battleships at Pearl to serve as bait, but also he understands the importance of the aircraft carriers in a later war with Japan. So he gets the aircraft carriers out of Pearl and puts them out on the high seas so that they're not going to be hurt in this attack. And sure enough, they were preserved, and they played a critically important role in the battle for the Pacific that U.S. forces ended up winning, after the attack of Pearl Harbor. But the battleships there were a nice target. People had told Roosevelt, what are you doing leaving these battleships there? You don't need to leave them there. You bring them back to the United States. That was the traditional thing, is, the U.S. is supposed to be supporting and defending the United States, you see. But no, he leaves these battleships there as bait. And so the Japanese attack, and Roosevelt, says, oh, I'm shocked. I can't believe this happened. But all the evidence establishes that Roosevelt knew exactly that the attack was coming. They had broken the diplomatic code, so they were reading the diplomatic messages that Japan was sending to its diplomats in Washington, telling them to, destroy all their stuff in their office, get ready to shut down operations. They were reading all these things. There's also powerful circumstantial evidence that the U.S. had also broken the military code. They won't tell us that. Still, this many years after World War II, that's classified, whether they broke the military codes or not. But every indication is that they did. And so if they did, they were reading the military messages of the carriers that were bringing over the bombers that ended up attacking Pearl. But one thing's for certain, that when Japan sent the final message to its diplomats indicating war, it was a weather message. It was called East Wind Rain. And U.S. officials knew what that meant because they'd been reading all the diplomatic messages secretly. Like I say, they had broken the Japanese code. Japan didn't know that, obviously. So when the East Wind Rain message comes in, that's it. They're telling their diplomats, we are going to war. Shred everything, etc., in the embassies and so forth. Well, U.S. officials got that message, and they treated that message just in a very nonchalant, easy-go-lucky method. In other words, they don't advise the two commanders at Pearl, the Army commander and the Navy commander, Kimmel and Short, they didn't advise them of, hey, we've got this east wind rain message. And they could have done it, through special courier or whatever. They could have gotten there in plenty of time. If nothing else, they could have picked up the phone. They had what were called scrambler phones, where the person hearing the message over there, he gets the message, but anybody in between there, like if somebody's tapping in, just gets a scramble, can't decipher it. But nonetheless, I mean, even if you were taking the chance of somebody, tapping in, this is the final chance to tell the commanders in Pearl, get ready, the attack's coming. And instead, they led him to believe that it was that the only threat they had was of sabotage, which meant that the Pearl commanders put all their planes together on the airstrips, like grouped together to protect against sabotage, which made them perfect targets for an attack from the air. While if they had gotten the east wind rain message indicating that war was imminent, they could have gotten the planes up in the air and gotten ready. But you see, Roosevelt couldn't afford to take the chance of them getting ready, because getting ready might have sent a message to the Japanese that says, this attack's going to be fruitless. The planes are up in the air, the battleships are out of there, they're ready, in which case Japan would have most likely turned around and gone back home. The surprise was really necessary to their operation. And so Roosevelt couldn't afford to really advise the commanders at Pearl of the imminency of this attack, because he knew that their getting ready might then discourage the Japanese from carrying out the attack. So the Japanese attack, and quite predictably, Roosevelt, I'm shocked, I'm stunned. And again, everything indicates that he wasn't shocked or stunned at all. He was relieved that, hey, he's now into the war, but he's only in the war against Japan. See, remember, he was trying to use this as a backdoor to war. Now, to his luck, Nazi Germany decides to declare war on the United States right after the Japanese attack, so that gets Roosevelt out of his quandary. Once Germany declared war, Congress has no choice. Now they're going to war against Germany, so they get a declaration of war against Germany and, of course, against Japan. And there's an important thing to notice about all this is that Japan never intended to invade and occupy the United States. We're often told that the war against Japan was for freedom and so forth. This was another war, by the way, where they had to conscript American men, which is interesting, because you would think that if enough people really believe that their nation's under attack, you don't have to force anybody to fight. But it reflects that most people understood that Japan never intended to invade the United States, and it didn't even have the military capability of coming over to the United States and invading and occupying the country. They wouldn't have had the supply lines. They wouldn't have had the personnel. An invasion was out of the question. Their only limited objective was to knock out the U.S. fleet to get their oil supplies. And sure enough, they invade the Dutch East Indies. They start getting oil. But the U.S. fleet goes on the attack. And because they had broken the military code by then, I'm almost certain that it was a fairly foregone conclusion that they were going to win the Pacific War, which, of course, they ended up doing with massive loss of life. But Roosevelt had gotten his objective, and that was U.S. entry into World War II over on the European side. And what's interesting about this, or one of the interesting aspects of it, is that he was willing to sacrifice the, 22,000 plus men at Pearl in order to achieve that objective. But you see, to him it was just a cost of freedom, that sometimes you've got to sacrifice innocent people for the greater good. And so he provokes the Japanese into attacking. He doesn't do anything to prevent that attack, and he ends up costing the lives of some 2,000 plus soldiers. And then, of course, World War II is finally over, and the U.S. declares it a great victory. England declares it a great victory, but as I indicated earlier, the people of Eastern Europe don't. I mean, the real winner of World War II, there's no question, it was not the United States and England. It was the Soviet Union. I mean, they're the ones that ended up with all of Eastern Europe and half of East Germany. And The English lost their empire. They became essentially a second-rate nation. The U.S. gets transformed into a national security state. We lose our limited government republic because immediately after the war, or soon after the war, Germany's official enemy, the Soviet Union, then becomes America's Cold War enemy. And so they engender this huge Cold War mentality that now America's facing a greater enemy than even Nazi Germany, and that's godless communism. And the supposed international communist conspiracy that was supposedly based in Moscow, Russia, and also extended over to Red China, and then the other communist countries, later Cuba and North Vietnam and North Korea and so forth. And so you got the whole Cold War racket arising out of World War II, and indirectly out of Roosevelt's shenanigans that he used to get America involved in World War II, which was provoking the Japanese and wanting the Japanese to attack the United States. So that's my message for the Libertarian Angle this month, as y'all know, or this week. As y'all know, this is our end-of-year fundraising time. You should have a fundraising letter by this time, either in writing or by email. I hope you'll give us your best consideration. If you donate $250 or above, you get a personal email message from me every month, or personal video message from me every month. It's as being a member of our FFF Freedom Club. For 32 years, you guys have kept us going, and we've been able to do what we do because of the generous support you give us, and we hope you'll consider that. I know times are tough for many people with this COVID nonsense, but I hope you'll help us out any way you can. We sure need your support to get us through the next year. As y'all know, we had 2 great conferences this year, one in the fall and one in the spring. We'd love to continue doing these kind of programs, and we depend on your support and these kind of programs, including the Libertarian Angle. So we hope you'll give us your positive consideration on your end-of-year support.